Welcome everyone. I'm really sorry I had a bit of technical issue just before. My name is Christine Cummins. I'm the author of Dignity in a Teacup, True Stories of Courage and Sacrifice from Christmas Island. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and where we work and live, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waterways, and also pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. So my story is that I published my book Dignity in a Teacup through Australian Scholarly Publishing out of Melbourne in February 2019, and I wrote the book after I had returned to mainland Australia after working as a torture and trauma counsellor on Christmas Island for 5 years. And I returned to Victoria, and that was just coming up 6 years ago. So it's been 6 years since I returned, but unfortunately the conditions and the treatment of people seeking asylum has remained really quite disheartening through those 6 years. We haven't seen any significant policy changes, and what we have seen instead is people just left either, if they're lucky enough to be on mainland Australia, they are sort of stuck in limbo on temporary protection visas, or there's still about 200 men stuck on Manus Island in PNG and Nauru. So unfortunately we still have a long way to go in advocating for very vulnerable people. And that was actually the motivation for me writing the book in the first place. It was really about trying to get the message out to encourage people to see people that were seeking asylum as more than something that you could be used for political spin, but rather as human lives that were worthy of advocating for. And I returned to Bendigo. I live in Bendigo, and I joined the Rural Australians for Refugees as soon as I returned. And what happened was the Rural Australians for Refugees, or RAR as they're called, are an advocacy group with many groups all across Australia, and they gave me a platform to go out and to start sharing my experience of being on Christmas Island and of being working with so many hundreds of asylum seekers over those years, and to be able to share some of the stories and the experience was really important to me. In fact, it was part of my own healing of after my experience there, but it was also a way for me to continue some work that I felt was very much unfinished work when I left and returned to mainland Australia. So I found that I was talking to audiences around mainly country Victoria, but some Melbourne audiences too that were interested in what I had to say. And what I found was, obviously, people that were turning up to my talks were already engaged in maybe some form of advocacy for refugees. So they were already an interested audience. But I found that they often were people that didn't really have a complete understanding of why it was people were fleeing different nations and different countries, and what some of those circumstances were. And also they really didn't have any idea of what it was like in immigration detention on Christmas Island, and the conditions under which people were held, and the changes of policies that had happened during the time that I was there. I arrived in January 2010, and when I arrived, the situation of immigration detention was it was still mandatory. Everyone was still put into detention, but what they had was processing on the island, and they saw a pathway through to humanitarian permanent visas. So it was the work that I did was a lot easier for me to be able to engage in, and for the team that I worked with, because we could see positivity and hope, and really good futures for a lot of very desperate people. While I was there, the number of boats that arrived just really increased incredibly. I was there when in about June 2010, they had stopped sending people off the island, and it had become a bit of a overcrowded, miserable place where there was a really it had been a really heavy wet season, and so conditions were becoming really quite difficult to really endure. They had overcrowded spaces absolutely in every site, and we had so many families, small babies and children, that were really stuck in tiny little rooms like shipping containers, and that was for months on end. There was a declaration that the Australian government wanted to do a bit of a check on the status of the situation in countries where a lot of our refugees had arrived from, and that was Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. And just a year prior, it had been the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, so that's why there'd been an enormous influx of boats from there. And they would travel all the way directly from Sri Lanka across to Christmas Island, across the Indian Ocean, and it would take an average 26 days on the open sea in wooden shipping vessels that were not made for such long distances, and certainly they could never carry quite enough food and water and fuel to make that journey. So often, more often than not, people would arrive in a really wretched state. They would be dehydrated and really unwell, and that was women, breastfeeding women, pregnant women, small children, elderly men and women. So it was people that were incredibly vulnerable, and then they were housed for sometimes months within the detention centre. And so the situation became quite volatile towards mid to late 2010, when there was a hold on processing and there was a backlog then. So we saw by 2011 immigration detention centre that had been originally built to house originally 500, then 800 people, and then there was a couple of other sites across the island as well, and all up they had close to 4,000 people housed across the island. And it was an enormous drain on infrastructure, but more importantly, it was an enormous psychological and physical and emotional drain on the people that were housed there. Eventually they opened up other detention centres across Australia. They sent a lot of unaccompanied minors all the way to Tasmania. They opened up the Curtin Detention Centre outside of Derby in WA, and then smaller ones across other areas of states and territories. And it just became a policy that people were sent off and locked up indefinitely. And gradually over time that I was there, the policies changed, the governments changed. The Gillard government reopened Manus Island and Nauru for regional processing, and that was supposed to be a deal to process people to be able to determine their refugee status. But there was, unfortunately, that just didn't happen, and there were people that were just left to pretty well rot there, and they're still there to this day. As I said before, there's still 200 men now detained across both islands, and they have been there now for coming up 8 years. So it's a really long time to be suffering, and they've all been granted refugee status. They've met the criteria for refugee status. So unfortunately, due to our current policies, that there's no pathway through to Australia. And so with that in mind, I try to get my message out about through my stories with Dignity in a Teacup. And it's really trying to humanise and to try and get people to, the reader, to connect with stories of ordinary people like you and I that have come across circumstance where it's no longer safe for them to remain in their country of origin. And so with Dignity in a Teacup, what I have tried to do is I start with a bit of a explainer about what it means to be a refugee and the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker and a displaced person, and the situation across the globe. You know, we have so many influences at the and they're growing even more, where we have such a terrible number. We have over 65 million displaced people across the world at the moment, and I personally don't see it as Australia's not doing in our global responsibility. I just don't think that we've stepped up enough to help and support that that number of people that are really needing to be settled and to be treated with some dignity. So when I go around and I do some talks at schools and libraries and community groups, what I try to do is share a few of my stories to encourage people to try and connect and to be able to really identify just the human element. So what I'm thinking is I might just share one little story about one of the young unaccompanied minors that I met. And in the book, what I do is I have given everybody a different identity, a different name, and I've tried to make sure that the names have a really a meaning of significance. And in the back of my book, I also have a list of all the names and their meanings. So with this particular boy, I called him Akhtar, and Akhtar was a young Afghan boy, and I just think I might read just a couple of little bits out of the chapter 6 out of Live Call. The first thing that struck me when I met Akhtar was what a beautiful looking boy he was. He had the most incredible, piercing green eyes and dark black hair, not unlike the famous Afghan girl National Geographic photograph. Akhtar was a 14-year-old Afghan boy who'd spent 2 months on his journey to Christmas Island, travelling alone through Pakistan, Malaysia and Indonesia. He'd been born and raised in Paktar province of Afghanistan and was from a small ethnic tribe used to a simple lifestyle. The men of his family had worked as shepherds for generations. When Akhtar turned 13, he started working with his dad. This was where he met a shepherd girl working the same hills, and they started a deadly friendship. Any liaison, no matter how innocent, with the opposite sex was strictly against the local Pashtun law, and this girl's brother was a member of the Taliban who took this law very literally. When her brother discovered their friendship, he was enraged, incensed with rage, and threatened to kill Akhtar to maintain his family honour. Akhtar's father tried to reason with the man, but when this failed, he offered himself instead of his son. The Taliban took Akhtar's father away. They cut his throat, decapitated and mutilated his body, and deliberately left his remains on the mountainside to be collected by Akhtar. The girl was the next victim. She was killed as a punishment for committing adultery and dishonouring her family name, and the young friends had not even held hands. Akhtar was forced to remain in hiding in the family home for 4 months until receiving further death threats, and a decision was made by his uncle and his mother that he must leave the country. His uncle arranged for his travel to Kabul and then on to Pakistan, where he stayed in Peshawar for 25 days. From Pakistan, he travelled to Malaysia and Indonesia, and finally by boat to Christmas Island. On Christmas Island, every new arrival was granted a phone call referred to as a live call. It's the opportunity to contact loved ones, to let them know that they've survived the journey. When Akhtar made his live call, he contacted people from his village and was told that his family had been forced to flee, so he had no way of contacting them or any knowledge of their whereabouts. When I sat with Akhtar, I found myself wondering how this simple shepherd boy managed to travel from the mountainside in Afghanistan to Christmas Island. Just 2 months prior, he'd never had a single night away from home. He'd never seen the ocean, and he was being raised in the traditions of rural Afghanistan, prioritising family, tribe, religion first, and now here he was, so hopelessly alone and scared. It's the way he bent his index finger of his right hand, and he bit hard on the knuckle, that I'll never forget. He was trying so hard not to cry when he looked directly at me with those gorgeous green eyes. His voice was only just above a whisper when he said, "I killed my father." It was then that he bit down on his finger to stop the tears, and an anguished sobbing cry caught us both off guard. I had to force myself from stopping to hug him, but really, he could have just broken my heart at that point. Akhtar was just one of many young kids that I met travelling on their own, but certainly he was one that I will never forget. He managed to be sent to the mainland, and luckily he arrived, or luckily in some ways, he arrived at a time when I was able to advocate for him to get straight through to community detention, where he could have access to other people of his ethnic group. Because when he arrived, he was the only person that spoke his language, so he was very, very isolated. And so I really tried to make sure that he was going to be looked after, and I was able to transfer his care over to another torture and trauma councillor on the mainland. And all I could do was hope and pray that Akhtar would be given the supports and the nurturing that he so desperately needed to be able to get on with a new life in a very, very foreign land, and hope that he was able to gain contact with his family back home and to hopefully, get on with his life. That was one of the many tragic stories that I come across, but it was those beautiful, vivid green eyes that I'll never forget. He was just such a gorgeous looking boy, and he honestly could have broken my heart. I also had a lot of really happy times, though. It wasn't all sad. I was able to really enjoy getting to know so many people, and I also had the honour of being able to get permission. All of our team got permission from immigration to become directed persons, and so that meant that we were able to have people that we were seeing, or as long as we knew people's boat numbers, we were able to get people signed into our guardianship for a number of hours. So we would get to know some of our clients really well, and from that I would then try and book a directed outing. And often case I would be counselling someone for a few months, and it might be a single male, and they would all be housed at Northwest Point, the big detention centre prison that was built up purposely on the island, and they would be sharing dormitories with other young men. So I would just ask them to give me the names and boat numbers of their three best friends or their roommates, and then I would go and put that application in for a directed outing for those other three people. So I'd be picking up people that I'd never met before, and it wasn't unusual for me to pack a picnic and go to the detention centre to pick up 4 young men for an outing, and for those other 3 men never to have stepped foot outside the gate since the day they arrived. So they might have arrived by boat and been driven in a bus into the detention centre even a year before, and this was the first time that they'd been allowed out. And so, of course, I would give them a taste of the island, the beauty of the island, let them have a swim, take them on a jungle walk, make sure that they had a beautiful picnic and food, and basically be treated with dignity and respect. And within half an hour of driving away from the detention centre, people would be whistling or singing, and it was always really joy-filled. It was wonderful. It was the half an hour before, or the 20 minutes before going back, that the car would get very, very quiet. And one young girl who I used to counsel described it as putting back on the cloak, the heavy cloak, to go back. It was like almost like a cloak of doom, which unfortunately had to happen at the end of those beautiful days. But I was able to have a lot of really great times with a lot of people and whole families, and it was just wonderful. The amount of joy that could bring, and simple acts of kindness, like baking some home baked goods and packing them along for a picnic, is just, absolutely such an important, simple little thing. And in fact, when I first arrived on the island and we were setting up the torture and trauma counselling service, I went to a little garage sale on the island, and one of the first things that I bought was a tea set, a simple tea set, and glasses. And so when anyone was invited in for counselling into our rooms, they were offered tea or coffee in a porcelain cup, and also glass of water in a glass, because it was those simple acts of decency and kindness that stood out so immensely to people. Because in detention you were served off plastic or styrofoam, and not allowed to have glass or anything that's really, everything is makeshift and disposable, and it just takes away people's dignity pretty quickly. So when it came to me writing my book, the title just sort of popped out in straight away. So dignity in a teacup was what I used to describe that act of just giving someone a cup of tea when they first were welcomed into the counselling space. It was really just providing that respect and dignity to very ordinary people, but it was that simple act that had so much meaning behind it. I might just read one other little story, and it's to do with one of those directed outings, and this one's about Ali. So on many occasions, I would ask in a session for someone to tell me about their happy memories, or for a single happy occasion in their life. As part of the therapy, we'd talk about that occasion, and I'd encourage people to believe that they would have similar occasions in the future as a pathway to hope. This technique worked well until I met 32-year-old Ali. I remember feeling so sad for this man when he told me he didn't have any happy memories, and I knew that he wasn't saying this to seek attention. He was genuine. I decided that I needed to create a moment of happiness, a memory for him to hold on to. I booked a directed outing for Ali and an interpreter, something I never normally bothered with, but as he was a single male, I thought it'd be more comfortable and appropriate for him to have the interpreter there. I baked late into the night to provide a special feast, and packed a picnic with real crockery, cutlery and a tablecloth, everything needed for an honoured guest. The three of us had an incredible day because the weather was perfect, the food was great, the ocean was calm, and the island was magnificent in its beauty. Nearing the end of the day, we were standing at a lookout called Margaret Knoll, which is high up, overlooking the top of the jungle and out to a beautiful ocean view. And Ali smiled. This was a huge, authentic smile, one that shines from the inside out. And he turned to me and said, "This is the happiest day of my life. This is happiness." And I just remember that drive when I came back from taking him back I normally would drive back with loud music and sing and just try and use that as a bit of a de-stress. But on that occasion, I remember I just had to have complete silence in that drive because I was just so sad that that day had been really his introduction to happiness. And it was also a moment of privilege where I felt like I could really make an impact, a simple impact on people's lives. And for many people, I've been lucky enough to be able to follow up and maintain some contact with some of these people. And for him, I was able to also follow up. So when it came time to writing some of these stories, I was able to get permission from these people. And although I still changed their names, I made sure that I was true to every moment and every element of their story. So I find that the stories are just too raw and too emotional and too often tragic to even consider needing embellishment. They are what they are, and that's the tragedy of the refugee story. Camilla's got a question. Do they have good medical care? Well, there's no refugees actually on Christmas Island anymore, but during the time that I was there, the International Health and Medical Service provided all the medical service within detention centres across Australia. In fact, they still do, and also on Nauru and Manus Island. So they actually provide fairly basic, to be honest, basic health care. They do health assessments. They have doctors that come. They have specialists that come every so often, like a visiting psychiatrist, maybe once a month or once every 6 weeks. And they had to be flown onto the island. The problem is, of course, the numbers increased incredibly, so that if you're looking at locking people up indefinitely, they're going to need access to more than a once every 6 week psychiatrist. So it became really quite a bit of a band-aid sort of treatment. The medical clinics were just really kind of just basic, handing out pills and a bandage and a bit of a band-aid. And most of the people that have been detained will normally tell you that they just say, drink plenty of water and have 2 Panadols, which is kind of a lot of what type of medicine that was provided. The Christmas Island Hospital, or the Indian Ocean Territories Hospital, was the main, or is the main hospital on Christmas Island. It's actually a Commonwealth-funded hospital. There's no surgery on the island, and there's no obstetrics, so islanders have to fly off to Perth on planned medical visits to go and have elective surgeries and babies. So it meant that people that arrived pregnant or in need of surgeries or in need of any emergency treatment, they had to be airlifted off the island. And Christmas Island is closer to Indonesia than mainland Australia. It's actually only around 350 nautical miles from Java Strait, so it's a good 4-hour flight from Christmas Island to Perth. So you can imagine that trying to get a medical Merri-bek onto the island takes a lot of time. You have to have the plane available. It has to be diverted from mainland Western Australia, and it has to be able to get to the island and refuel and turn around and go back. The other thing about the island is that it has a notoriously shocking runway. It's a short runway, and it's set up on the top of the island on a big sort of hill, and it's a tropical island, so it has high lot of rainfall and condensation, and so landing the plane can be very, very difficult. It's not unusual for a plane to not be able to visually see the airstrip, so they can't land, and they will go out and do giant big laps around for a while, trying to wait for clouds to clear. And if they don't clear in time, then they will have to turn back and avert the trip altogether. So medical care on the island can be really quite dire, and so it's not an ideal location to have long-term detention, and it's certainly not a good place for to be faced with a medical emergency. We often would present our cases with immigration detention, and I was there for 5 years on the island. So I started off for the first 2 years as one of the team members. Then in the last 3 years, I became the team leader, the manager of the service. So it became down to me to present our cases to immigration, and we would put in clinical recommendations for ongoing care for the people that we were seeing. And it was really important that we only put in recommendations for the most dire cases, because we had to really fight to get our cases heard. Within the first probably 2 or 3 years, it was a lot easier. People really were valuing our insight and our input, and they would act on our recommendations because they still were open to having people on mainland Australia. So we could get people admitted into hospitals and onto surgeries and all sorts of have their needs met eventually. But once the shutters come down and they decided that there was no refugee, no one that arrived by boat would be stepping foot on Australia, and that they would only be going to Nauru or Manus Island, then it became really incredibly difficult to try and be able to get anyone sent to the mainland. We had to fight to get psychotic people who were actively suicidal and on death's door, to be able to be medevaced to Perth. And it would come down to a public servant who would be making those decisions. They'd be ringing through to Canberra, and it was incredibly difficult to have our voices heard, and we were trying to be a voice for the extremely vulnerable. So it became so depleting and exhausting, and that was the state that I was in when I returned. I felt really battered and bruised, and it was the case for all of our team. We really were dismissed, particularly in the last year that we were there. Eventually, they actually closed our service down, and they eventually moved everyone off the island not long after we left. They did reopen it on a couple of occasions, and at the moment the facility's open, but it's actually open for people that have been in Australia on a different type of visa, and they've committed crimes, and they're on a pathway to be deported. So they're using it as a place to sort of put people and forget about them, which is also a really horrible issue for those people. It's they're vulnerable people, so it's really sad. So there was also I'm just conscious of the time. I forgot to actually check it when I finally went. So I'll just share one other story, and this story that I like to share is this woman who I call Jamila, and Jamila is an Arabic word name, and it means beautiful. And although this lady, she's not actually Arabic, I just like the name because I think she was absolutely beautiful inside and out, and I thought that from the very moment that I laid eyes on her. So Jamila was 75 years old when I met her, and she had come all the way from Iran on her own, and she had never left Iran before. So this was her very first overseas trip. And what had happened with Jamila is she had spent her whole life really advocating for access to basic human rights for the Kurdish people. And so she was really quite vocal, and she had, been lived all of her life in Iran, but gradually the rights of the Kurds were over time removed, and particularly after the Islamic Revolution. So they really became stateless people with no human rights, very limited access to education, to healthcare, to land ownership, to so many basic things that we take for granted. So she had been a very vocal advocate and had obviously become a thorn in the side of authorities. She had married and had kids, and they'd all gradually grown up and joined this real big fight. Her husband ended up, she lost her husband, and then gradually, one by one, her children all left because they were constantly being imprisoned and persecuted. And so they, I think, planned to pave the way and then be able to bring their mum. But what happened was she ended up, every time she tried to leave the country, and they were trying on so many occasions to get her out, every time failed. And she kept getting arrested and being targeted. So to the point when it was her last arrest, she was tortured and imprisoned, and her wrist was deliberately shattered, and she was withheld medical attention so that she would be permanently maimed in her favoured hand. So when she was released, she went home, and that was enough for her. She had really decided that she couldn't do it anymore. She was on her own, and she just felt completely depleted. So luckily, she had a good neighbour who stepped in, and he said, "We have to get you out of here." She had a couple of grown-up children that were already given permanent visas here in Australia. So he set up and organised her trip all the way through from Iran to getting on a boat to Christmas Island. And so she was taken through that journey with a smuggler. And when she arrived on Christmas Island, though, she had lost all of her belongings, and she had only the clothes that she stood in. And she was absolutely one of the most traumatised people that I had met, because Jamila had been tortured on more occasions than she could actually recall. And so being locked up and in a foreign land with so many foreign things happening around her, it just really amplified all of those trauma symptoms and made her just absolutely the most vulnerable woman. So she was referred to us, and I started seeing her, and I could see that detaining her was amplifying those symptoms, and that she needed to get off the island, and she needed to get to her children on the mainland. Unfortunately, this was going on when the government was saying there's absolutely no chance that anyone can come to mainland Australia, and she was being told through interpreters very frequently that she was about to be sent to Nauru. So I had heard that there was a visiting people from Canberra that were out doing an inspection of the facilities, and they were the immigration health advisory sort of group. And I had met one of the people a couple of years prior, and they had come on the island without my knowledge, and which was not unheard of. Immigration at that point were not really open to me being able to have any meeting with anyone official. They didn't want me to meddle. So we had a really lovely relationship with a nun, Sister Dorothy, who worked on and off the island for a couple of years for the Jesuit social services. And she came to visit me and said, "Chris, there's people visiting the island at the moment. They're going to fly off, and I thought you should know that they're here." Well, I knew that it was a Thursday and the plane would be taking off at 4 o'clock, so I quickly printed off the latest recommendations that I had given to all the way through to Canberra, but I was just not being heard. And I raced up to the airport and targeted this group and this man in particular that I'd met before, and insisted I had a word with him, and I pleaded with him to try and speak to the minister and get special consideration for Jamila's case. And he assured me that he was actually meeting with the minister 3 days from that time. So he took my recommendations, and he assured me he would raise it. And thankfully, I think that that worked, because she was eventually taken off the island and into community detention, and finally released into being able to live with her daughter. And but before she had done that, I had already I was determined to get her off the island, because I thought if she goes to Nauru, she will die. I had no doubt about it. So I got her to bring me her daughter's phone number, and I would ring her daughter and allow Jamila time to talk to her when she was in my office. And then I also brought my camera in one time, and some nice clothes and beads, and gave them to Jamila, and took some beautiful photos of her, so that she could that I could email them to her family, because they hadn't seen her for quite a lot of years. And I thought they're going to get a shock when they finally meet their mum and she meets her grandchildren for the first time. I wanted them to be prepared. She still looked very regal, she looked beautiful, but I just thought it was important that they have a recent photo of their mum. And I've still got those photos, and I was able to get permission from Jamila to share her story in the book. She was one of the most feisty, amazing women, a real freedom fighter, and she's now 80 years old and living in Sydney with her daughter, and hopefully enjoying life, as she should, as her earned. So Jamila was one of the treasures that I met, but there were so many of those people. And that was my motivation for writing my book, and it's really about getting those stories out, that they're ordinary people just like you and I, that there's no reason that it couldn't have been you, or that, you know, your dad or your mum, and what would you do if it was them that you needed to fight for. I can tell you now, I would be taking my daughter on a boat if I needed to try and save her life, and I think that's the greatest act of love and bravery, and I really dispute the argument that someone's being really, selfish by doing that. I think that's the least selfish act. And I'm probably babbling on now. If anyone, I know that the Moreland City libraries do have copies of my book, but if anyone wanted to buy a copy, you can find them on Dimmicks online, or go into your local bookshop and try and find yourself a copy. You can also just ask them to order them in, or you can go onto the publisher's website, the Australian Scholarly Publishing, and get yourself a copy. I really am trying to get the message out that if people do buy it, that I really wrote it to share, and I really want people to be able to read it and then pass it on through family and friends and over the fence, because the aim is that it's to humanise and to really try and bring about some compassion, and to encourage people to advocate and to bring about some change in our policies and in our thinking about really ordinary people that are extraordinary in so many ways. So I think that's probably it from me. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm hoping that this has been interesting, and that you will remain interested, and hopefully be able to take the time to read my book. And I'm really it's disappointing that I'm not there to share in person, because I always love to talk in person and then meet with people afterwards, and it's normally a really good opportunity to have a bit more of a yarn. So Dignity in a Teacup, recommend it, and thank you everybody. I don't think there's anything else that I needed to say. So thank you so much. Bye.